In trying to understand why the world is as it is and why our lives are as they are, I've found that one of the most underappreciated factors is the factor called precedent. The idea that what has come before becomes an expectation and becomes the likely result in the future. And precedent is very critical in terms of our survival as people and in terms of our ability to relate to each other. However, precedent, when unchecked and ununderstood, can become more problematic than good in some cases. So let's talk a little bit about what precedent is, why it exists in the world, and where it can go awry. To start this off, I want to give you kind of the example of children playing maybe with a ball in a field. And let's say they're not trying to play soccer or football or baseball or anything like that. They're just playing with a ball. And at first, it's just chaos. One person kicks the ball, another person throws the ball, another person runs in circles around the ball, and there's not really any expectation. And then maybe a few people in a row do the same thing. What they're doing is they're establishing a precedent. They're establishing an idea of what is being done. We are running around in circles around the ball, or we are digging a tunnel under the ball, or we are kicking the ball, right? They're starting to establish a pattern of behavior, and that starts to be a precedent. Once you establish a precedent, you establish an expectation. So at the start, when everybody's doing random things, if one person kicked a ball, another person throws a ball, another person spits on the ball, it's totally fine, who cares? But once one person starts digging a tunnel under the ball, if the next person comes along and moves the ball, the first person's pissed off. That ball was what I was digging my tunnel under, right? So this precedent, the fact that there's this agreed upon thing that is occurring, starts to develop more and more expectation, and there starts to be more and more resistance to change. When we interact with someone, the way that we start interacting with them, the way we continue to interact with them, establishes an expectation. What's the difference between two people that enjoy each other's company in a one-off event versus two people in a relationship? Or what's the difference between two people that have a couple things in common versus people who have decided to make a business, make a partnership, form a relationship, and enjoy those things over and over again? It's essentially precedent. It's essentially these shared expectations that eventually sometimes become codified, written down, formalized, etc. So precedent is, in fact, in a sense, what relationships even are. And so with this in mind, if you want the right types of relationships, it's very important you start setting the right types of precedents. When a negative precedent starts, it seems kind of contentious or rude or unpleasant to stand up against that precedent. It's not a rigid thing, it's not a rule, it doesn't seem like a big deal, so it's a lot easier to just go along to get along. It's a lot easier to be like, you know what, the overall relationship's good, this little precedent thing, it's not a big hassle, I don't want to I don't want to risk the whole relationship on this little precedent thing, so I'm not going to make a big deal of it. The problem is that precedents get stronger over time. The more you let a precedent exist, the more it grows and the more it becomes solidified. And so if you don't handle it on day one, by day 5, that awkwardness of day 1 has been magnified and it would be even harder on day 5. On top of that, because you've let the precedent exist and exist and exist, you seem even more irrational to now be opposing it, right? You let it go, and now you're opposing it. Now you seem unreasonable. Now you seem like you're just in a bad mood. So in fact, the earlier you start dealing with these precedents, the better off you're going to be. And in fact, if you want to build good relationships, you should try to be the one setting the precedents or try to be the one deciding what precedents are established from the very start. You need to be thinking, if this behavior is to continue indefinitely, and if this behavior is to become more solidified and more codified, is this something I would be comfortable with down the road? If you started dealing with the precedent when it's at a level 1 out of 10, not only is it not a big emotional deal for you, it's probably not a big emotional deal for the other party yet. It's just getting started, it's not a big deal. There's not a lot of investment into that thing. And so not only is it easier to handle, but also you can handle it in a more lighthearted way. You can handle it in a way while you're handling it but still downplaying it. You need to handle it in a way that's still friendly. Whereas if you let someone push you all the way to your absolute limit, not only have they become more entrenched, has that expectation become more set, but also there's a lot more emotion behind it. And so it's going to be a huge confrontation when you do eventually address it. It's one of those situations, you may have heard the phrase, an ounce of prevention beats a pound of cure. That's absolutely the case with negative precedents. And you really do want to get in ahead of them and nip them in the bud. And this exists not just on a personal level, but on a societal level. A lot of times you'll see these sweeping societal changes and people will seem to be blindsided by them, but they shouldn't be. So typically when you see these massive movements, it's not that they happened all at once. What it was one tiny little boundary got crossed and people figured, oh, it's not worth fighting over. There's too much negative, too much blowback. I'm not going to do it, or I'm not going to stand up. And then another boundary and another boundary and another boundary and another boundary until you get to a point where it's at the snapping point and they reach a boundary that you absolutely will not tolerate. and now you have to put up a big resistance to it, and now it's this big turmoil, this big even fight, even wars in some cases, right? Whereas if it had just been handled at the start in a friendly manner, in a friendly but firm manner, it would have been much better. But the problem is, it's very easy to not take responsibility. It's very easy to say someone else will do it later, or this isn't my fight. I'll tell you, the people who I respect a lot are the type of people who will stand up early to particular narratives. The people who will actually say, you know what, this is wrong and I'm not doing it. And oftentimes, the first people along those lines may even appear a little bit silly at first. And then years later, you look back at them like, oh, what a hero. What a visionary. But at the time, they appear silly. Why? Because it seems like their response to the precedent is disproportionate. It seems like they're having an overblown response to a really small thing. And it's that very fact that the response in order to stop the precedent needs to be a little overblown compared to what it is in order to actually be effective. But that overblown response at level 1 is microscopic compared to what a normal response at level 6 would be. Let's say you're in a relationship and somebody does something a little bit disrespectful. Like maybe they're supposed to meet up with you and they kind of do a no-call, no-show. And you're like, you know what, the relationship's overall good. It's not worth risking the whole relationship on. I'm not even gonna mention it, right? And then they feel they have permission to do a no-call, no-show again. And now there's a precedent established and you didn't deal with it the first time, you're not gonna leave it the second time. Once they've done it 5 or 6 or 7 times, they just get used to certain disrespectful behaviors and it starts to really rag on you and eventually it may destroy the whole relationship. Whereas if in the first place you were to handle it, but handle it calmly, be like, hey, listen, it's totally cool. I know, shit happens, whatever. But just in the future, if this does happen, just do please give me a call. It's just a courtesy. I appreciate it. But yeah, no big deal. Let's go on having a good time. You can handle it very softly, very easily, very not a big deal, very just, thrown off casual thing. But you stood your ground in some small way and you stopped the precedent from forming. Contrast that to a major divorce where you're now having the narrative, you've been disrespecting me for years and you just don't, you just violate my personal space and all my parameters, right? That whole fight potentially could have been solved up front with that little quick offhanded comment, right? So solve it when it's a small thing before the precedent's established rather than letting the precedent get established. Now, as precedents do get established, they get harder and harder and harder, and there's even less desire to fight that. But understand, no matter how far it's come, if you don't stand up, it's only going to get worse. So you got to bite the bullet and you got to handle it earlier rather than later. Take a little bit of pain now instead of a lot of pain later.